Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our topic about the American literature. First, we will be talking about its history. Little background. American literature refers to the written works in the English language that is produced in the United States of America. Like all national literatures, American literature was molded by the history of the country that created it. For over a century and a half, America was just a set of colonies by Great Britain, distributed along the eastern shoreline of the North American continent. Colonies from which a few courageous men hesitantly journeyed westward. America became the United States, a country following a victorious uprising against the motherland. By the turn of the 20th century, this country had spread north to the 49th parallel, south to the Gulf of Mexico, and west to the Pacific. It had established itself as one of the world's powers by the end of the 19th century, and because of how closely its fortunes were tied to those of other countries, it was inevitable that it would get involved in both the world wars as well as the issues that Europe and East Asia faced in the years that followed. Meanwhile, numerous changes in people's lives were brought about by the development of science and industry, as well as shifts in thinking and emotion. The literature of the United States was influenced by all of these developments in the nation. In the 17th century, the arrival of English-speaking Europeans in what would become the United States marks the beginning of this history of American literature. Initially, English-speaking authors who thought and wrote in an English manner produced organically colonial American literature. The founding of American literature is attributed to John Smith, a soldier of fortune. His most notable works were the General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, and A True Relation of Virginia. These books were ostensibly meant to explain colonial potential to Englishmen, even though they frequently exalted their creator. Over time, each colony was similarly described. Thomas Ashe, Carolina, William Penn's brief account of the province of Pennsylvania, and Daniel Denton's brief description of New York are just of a few of the many publications hailing America as a continent of economic potential. These authors recognized their devotion to the British monarchy, but emphasized the ideological divisions that prompted the colonies to flee their native country. More significantly, they debated political issues regarding the interplay between religion and state. Biographies, treatises, travelogues, and sermons were among the 17th century's utilitarian publications. The Bee Psalm Book of 1640 and Michael Wigglesworth's presentation of Calvinism in doggerel rhyme, The Day of Doom, both contained bad but popular poetry. Every piece of American writing from the 17th century followed the style of contemporaneous British writing. In the same way that Bradford in the Mothers and Roger Williams imitated the King James Bible's rhythms, John Smith wrote in the traditional geographic writing. Taylor followed in the footsteps of metaphysical writers like George Herbert and John Donne, whilst Anne Bradstreet drew inspiration from a long series of British poets, including Spenser and Sidney. Thus, the literature of this first century in America was distinctly English in both substance and form. The 19th century. Some authors, like Cotton Mather, continued the earlier customs in America in the early 18th century. The American Revolution highlighted the widening crisis or contrast between American and British political ideologies. The colonies were inspired by a number of very successful political authors, including loyalist Joseph Galloway and supporters Samuel Adams and John Dickinson, as they came to believe that revolt was unavoidable, waged a bloody war, and sought to establish the new nation's government. However, Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin towered above this. Franklin authored a variety of essays, pamphlets, and reports about the disagreement with Great Britain. Many of them were incredibly effective in articulating and defining the colony's case because of his self-attained culture, which was broad and profound. Thomas Paine relocated from his home in England to Philadelphia, where he worked as a magazine editor before becoming the most successful propagandist for the colonial cause roughly 14 months later. His essay Common Sense, published in January 1776, has a significant impact on the colony's decision to proclaim their independence. Some of these brilliant guys were no longer able to get a hearing after the war. Thomas Paine and Samuel Adams lacked the collective idea that piqued the curiosity of those seeking to build a new government. Others fared better, like Franklin. Thomas Jefferson and the outstanding writers of the Federalist paper, a series of 85 essays published in 1787 and 1788 extolling the advantages of the proposed new constitution, were leaders in the new epoch. During and after the war, Thomas Jefferson was a powerful political writer. As Madison put it, the strengths of his major summation, the Declaration of Independence, were in a straightforward expression of human rights in a language and tone suited to the big occasion and to the spirit of the American people. During the American Revolution, both Loyalists and Continentals used poetry and songs to rally their forces, state their agreements or arguments, and celebrate their heroes such as Yankee Doodle, Nathan Hale, and the Epilogue, which were mostly set to popular British melodies and written in the style of other British poems of the time. Dramas and novels of historical significance were written in the years leading up to the end of the 18th century. Though theater organizations had long existed in America, Royal Tyler's Contrast was the first professional American comedy. The Power of Sympathy, by William Hill Brown, the first novel to be published in the United States, was written in 1789 and demonstrated for writers how to shatter long-standing misconceptions about this genre by adapting Samuel Rogerson's invention of the emotional poet or novel. After the turn of the 20th century, there was a deluge of emotional books. The 19th century. American authors were encouraged to create fully national literature following the American Revolution and more so after the War of 1812. Four extremely reputable authors suddenly surfaced as if in reaction. A significant half-century of literary advancement was started by William Cullen Bryant, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and Edgar Allan Poe. The humorists, the traditional New Englanders, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, and others who rose to fame in the 1830s and continued to write up to around the conclusion of the Civil War, accomplished their work in a new spirit, and their accomplishments were of a new kind. This was partly due to the fact that they were affected in some kind of manner by the expanding democratic ideas that won in 1829 with Andrew Jackson's inauguration as president. They included a lot of America in their novels during the Romantic era, and time when native scenery and characters were highly valued in many literary works. That's all for the first half of this part of the history of the American culture.
So hello everyone, I'm Kimberly Embertusio and I am the second reporter, and I'm gonna discuss the continuation of the history of American literature. So from realism up to contemporary period. So let's have first the realism. So in this period, the writers left behind the styles and topics adopted by their previous generation. Instead, they rather concentrated on describing life as it was with its negative typical. And this period also was considered as the era of industrialization, and migration, where determinism was a major paradigm. And there was also this called regionalism, the local color school. So what do you mean by local color school? So local color school is any group of authors who describe the customs and specific of particular regions. So to put it simply, during realism period, the writers were focusing on describing the life negatively, and one of the main genre was a novel. And one of the novelists and member of local color school was Samuel Langhorne Clemens, where his famous novels is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So this novel was describing the life of a problem boy. And next we have here the naturalism. So in fact, naturalism is an extreme form of realism. So but then the writers in this period were portrayed people in extreme situations and describe their real behavior. So and also their books are full of dirty environments, poor neighborhoods, drunks, crime, and illiteracy. And the group of authors or writers in this period was called muckrakers. So what is muckrakers? Muckrakers are referred to any group of American writers identified with pre-World War I pre-form and exposed writing, and they also provided detailed accounts or accurate journalistic accounts of political and economic corruption and even social hardships caused by the power of big business in a rapidly industrializing United States. So that means that this period, during this naturalism period, there were being changes actually. So like writers were portraying people in extreme situations, and one example of this story that relates this is about a girl. The title is Maggie, a Girl in the Street, which talks about a prostitute in New York, and that was written by Stephen Crane. And that's it for the naturalism and the realism. Now let's move on to the next period, the modernist period. So it occurred between 1930 to 1945. So during this period, the writers were looking for new ways of writings and even new topics. So and their writings express their feelings about living in the modern age, and some of them are written positively and some are negatively. And during this period also, many movements appeared, like the modernist movements. I know you are familiar with this, like the Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, the Style, and many other. While in this period, one of the most influential poets who was involved in pioneering new styles and movements like Imagism and Buddhism was Ezra Pound, and he was also considered as the most complex writers in American history, and one of his work was called Cantos. And there was this also called the Lost Generation. So what is Lost Generation? Well, Lost Generation is a term invented by Gertrude Stein. Well, the Lost Generation is referred to a group of writers who felt alienated to a world. Means they wrote about young people who do not find any pleasure in everyday life. Or Ernest Hemingway was a member of this group called the Lost Generation, and he was probably the most famous representative. And one of his famous novelette also was called The Old Man and the Sea, which talk about the struggle of a fisherman and the struggle of the fisherman and the natural world. So now let's have the last period, which is the contemporary period. Well, during this period, many movements appeared, like the Beat Generation and even hippies. So what is Beat Generation? Well, Beat Generation also called a group of nonconformist authors. So they refused to fit in the society, revolted against the establishments, and even experimented with drugs and criticized consumerism. Well, they also preferred spontaneity and traveling, and their literature is still popular and inspiration for many young people. And one example of that is On the Road, which is a kind of a Bible for his followers, which talk about the stories or tells the stories of the people traveling across America, and that was wrote by Jack Kerouac. And also there were many ethnic writers became more involved, like the Native American, the Asian, the Jewish, and even the African American. and some of them are called, some of them is called the postmodernist. And in this period also, the new topics became more popular, like the revolt against the system, ethnic and racial issues, the Holocaust, and even new genres was flourished in this period, like comic books, fantasy, novels, sci-fi, and even horror stories. One of the famous work during this period was wrote by Judy Salinger, and it was a short novel, The Catcher in the Rye, which talked about a young man leaving his university study for he disgusted the people around him. And so that's it. That's how the American literature goes. So thank you for listening, and God bless.
Good day, everyone. I am Johanna May Odoble. So today I'm going to discuss the authors in American literature. So now let's proceed to the first author. Nell Harper Lee was born on April 28, 1926 in Monroeville, Alabama, and her parents are Amasa Coleman and Francis Cunningham. She is descended from Robert E. Lee, which is the Civil War commander of the Confederate Army. Harper Lee was an American novelist, best known for her 1960 novel entitled To Kill a Mockingbird. And also it won the 1961 Pulitzer Prize and has become a classic of modern American literature, and also contributed to her earning the 2007 Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, let's proceed to the famous works of Harper Lee. In July 1960, entitled To Kill a Mockingbird was published and picked up by the Book of the Month Club and the Literary Guild. So in April of 1961, the magazine published entitled Love in Other Words. It is Lee's meditation on the meaning of love, into which she deftly wove threads as desperate as the affection Prince Edward bore for his mistress, the Gospel of St. Paul, and the Cervantes' zest of life. Harper Lee published her second novel entitled Go Set a Watchman in July 2015. The story was a first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird and followed the later lives of the novel's characters. Main themes of her stories include prejudice, family life, courage, as well as good versus evil, racial prejudice theme, courage and bravery theme, justice versus the law, and knowledge. Next is John Steinbeck, was a Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winning American novelist and the author of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, and East of Eden. In 1962, Steinbeck was awarded the Nobel Prize for his realistic and imaginative writing, which carried humor and a keen social perception. Steinbeck's second most famous book is entitled Of Mice and Men, which tracks a similar narrative entitled The Grapes of Wrath. This book, which was conceived as a hybrid between a play and a novella. The Grapes of Wrath tells the story of a family of impoverished farmers during the Great Depression who lose their livelihood. The best remembered as the loose basis for the film of the same name, entitled East of Eden, is about the moral struggles of two families in Salinas Valley, California. In sharing his vision of what it means to be human, Steinbeck touches on several themes such as the nature of dreams, the nature of loneliness, and man's propensity for cruelty, powerlessness, and also economic injustices, and the uncertainty of the future. Next is Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, poet, critic, and editor best known for evocative short stories and poems that captured the imagination and interest of readers around the world. Poe received two awards in his lifetime. One was a $50 prize for MS Found in a Bottle awarded by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor in October 1833. The other one was a $100 prize awarded by the Dollar newspaper for his story entitled The Gold Bug. Next is his famous works. Entitled The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe and it was published in Graham's magazine in 1841. Next is Lenore is a poem by the author Edgar Allan Poe. It began as a different poem entitled Apian and was not published as Lenore until 1843. The poem discusses proper decorum in the wake of the death of a young woman, described as the queenliest dead that ever died so young. Next is on January 29, 1845, his poem entitled The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror and became a popular sensation. Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer of poetry and short stories that explored themes of death, regret, and lost love. Now let's move on to Ernest Hemingway. He was a famous American storyteller from the 20th century. He is considered to be one of the most important American authors whose work was influenced by his journalism. Ernest Hemingway, he liked novels and short stories and really stood up with the novel about the First World War, A Farewell to Arms, and the short novel entitled The Old Man and the Sea, and he got a Nobel Prize in 1954. Ernest Hemingway was awarded a Bronze Star for his bravery during World War II in 1947. And he also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1952 for the novel The Old Man and the Sea. His famous works, first entitled is The Sun Also Rises, is a 1926, which written by Ernest Hemingway. The novel's main theme is that of the lost generation. The second one is A Farewell to Arms. It is a novel also, and it is set in Italy during World War One, and it became his first bestseller. The third one, For Whom the Bell Tolls, is one of his best known works and was published in 1940. So, Hemingway served in the military for most of his life and also enjoyed drinking and reflected these characteristics onto his characters. Therefore, common themes in his works include heroic fatalism and disillusionment after warfare, and common motives include excessive drinking and also ideal masculinity. Let's proceed to the last author, which is Toni Morrison. She is one of the most celebrated authors in the world. Toni Morrison original name is Chloe Ardelia Morrison. She was born on February 18, 1931 in Lorraine, USA. She is American writer noted for her examination of Black experience, particularly Black female experience within the Black community. Morrison is one of the famous American authors to receive accolades in her lifetime, including the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1977. Morrison also won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction for the critically acclaimed novel entitled Beloved in 1987, and she received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1933, and also in 2010 Morrison was made an officer of the French Legion of Honor. And 2 years later, she was awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom. So now let's proceed to her famous works. The first one is Sula in 1973. It is a portrait of black female friendship as well as a firstly black female character. The second one is entitled Song of Solomon in 1977. This novel was Morrison's third book and one of her most ambitious. It is a stylistic tour de force that stretches across literary genre. Next is the Beloved in 1987. It is haunted by an angry and vengeful specter. The themes of rape, brutal violence, and all are not for the faint of heart, and have made the classic novel. So many of Toni Morrison's themes and subjects are good and evil, love, hate, friendship, beauty, and also ugliness and death. Toni Morrison's novels and poems can be analyzed in regard of two important literary elements, which are the theme and symbolism. So here are the reference of my report.
Hi everyone, my name is Daisy Jane Macias. So for today's video, I am going to talk about the American literature. And I also have a story, and this story belongs to American literature. And the title of this story is It Could Always Be Worse by Margaret Zenn. Okay, so before we proceed to our story, so I want you to know about what defines American literature. Okay, American literature is a literature written or produced in the United States of America and its preceding colonies. So for a specific discussion of poetry and theater, so see poetry of the United States and the theater in the United States. And also, who is the father of American literature? So Samuel Langhorne Clemens, November 30, 1835, known by his pen name Mark Twain, was an American writer, a humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. He lauded as the greatest humorist the United States has produced, and William Faulkner called him the father of American literature. The story It Could Always Be Worse is a Yiddish folk tale. It tells the story of a poor, unfortunate, hardworking man who lives in a tiny house with his wife and children. So one day, unable to take it any longer, so he visited his rabbi and asked for his advice. And now let's proceed to the authors. Margaret Zemek. Margaret Zemek was an American illustrator of more than 40 children's books, some of which she also wrote. Many were adaptations of folk tales from around the world, especially Yiddish and other Western European stories. Margaret Zemek's It Could Always Be Worse in 1977 New York Times Book Review Notable Children's Book of the Year, an Outstanding Book of the Year, and 1978 Caldecott Honor Book. And also an award-winning children's book illustrator and author whose witty lively work reinterpreted folk tales for younger readers, died, and Lo Gehrig deceased Sunday at her home in Berkeley, California. It could always be worse. The Little Red Hen, Duffy, the Devil, the Judge, and Untrue Tale, Jake and Honey Bunch book. So those are the story that she made. Okay, so Margot Zemak was born in Los Angeles. So when she was growing up there during the Great Depression, she used drawing to make people laugh, but she never had enough paper. So she studied at the Los Angeles Country Art Institute and a Fulbright scholarship in 1955 to 1956 at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna in Austria. So for literary theory, so it could always be worse introduces relativism, arguing that our interpretation of experiences matters more than the experiences themselves. So when a poor and fortunate man can no longer take the pains of his cramped, noisy, impoverished existence, so he seeks the advice of holy rabbi or his rabbi. So he tells the man to do some extraordinary things. So the rabbi's suggestion will work at the end of the story. So you'll see the interesting you will see how interesting this story is. So the poor unfortunate man got a decent night rest. Okay, so for the literary text, so the title is It Could Always Be Worse, and the genre is children's literature, fiction, or folk tales. And then the description is, It Could Always Be Worse is a Yiddish folk tale about a poor, unfortunate man lived with his mother, his wife, and his 6 children in one room hut. So for the summary of this story, so a poor unfortunate man once lived in a small village with his mother. So his mother, his wife, and his 6 children in a tiny one-room hut. Because they were so crowded, the man and his wife frequently quarreled, so the children were noisy and they fought. So life was tough in the winter when the nights were long and the days were cold. The hut was full of crying and fighting. One day, when unfortunate man could not stand it any longer, he ran to the rabbi, I'll follow your instruction. So the rabbi considered hers as a taunt on his tell me. So my poor man, do you have any animals, perhaps a chicken or 2? He finally replied, a sporting and scratchy bird. When some days or weeks had gone by, life in the hut was worse than before now, with the quarreling and crying, so there was honking and crowing. The goat went wild, pushing and battling everyone with his horns. So the hut seems smaller, so the children grow bigger. When the unfortunate man couldn't stand it any longer, he ran to the rabbi again. Holy Rabbi, help me. He screamed. Now the goat is running wild. So my life is a nightmare. The rabbi listened and thought. At last he said, tell me, my poor man, it is impossible that you have a cow. Young or old doesn't matter. Yes, Rabbi, it's true, I have cow, said the poor man and fearfully. The unfortunate man vowed to do it immediately and went home to let the animals out of his small cottage, including cow, goat, chicken, ghost, and rooster. There was plenty of room to breathe that night as poor man. An entire family slept soundly. There was no crowing, clunking, and honking. So, okay, It Could Always Be Worse story provides a potent a potential reminder that things are not always as bad as they seem. We know life is hard for the low-income family in the story, and the father can no longer take his shocks loud, distracting and cramped quarters. So what does a clever rabbi do to show the man that things are not so bad? He tells the father to do something that will make the situation worse. So philosophically speaking, an exciting theme that emerges in the story comes with the realization that while the living conditions are the same for the older men at the beginning of the story as they are at the end, something else that changed.
Good morning, everyone. I am Tiffany James Dubalani, and today I am going to tackle my part, which is the new criticism. Post-World War I School of American Literary Critical Theory. The new criticism definition is a new way of teaching literature by analyzing a work based only on that work's text. In other words, this theory analyzes only what is present in a work of literature and does not take anything else into account, such as the author or historical and cultural significance. While those who use the theory do not completely disregard author or background, they are in favor of the idea that everything needed to understand the work is present within it and that the other factors have very little bearing on or relevance to the meaning of the literature. John Crowe Ransom. In 1941, this new type of criticism finally got its name from literary critic John Crowe Ransom. In this book, he was an educator, a literary critic, and a poet. The new criticism, which provided some of the early principles of analyzing literature based only on its text. Many authors and critics contributed to the ideas of new criticism, helping it to become one of the most popular methods of analysis in the mid-20th century. The technique employed in the new critical approach is close analytic reading of the text, or close reading approach. So, close reading is a method of literary analysis which focuses on the specific details of a passage or text in order to discern some deeper meaning present in it. The new critics, however, introduced refinements into the method. Early seminal works in tradition were those of the English critic I.A. Richards. Though the practices of close reading can be seen before the 20th century, literary critics like Ivor Armstrong Richards helped to refine the techniques into what is known as new criticism. Richards published Critical Criticism in 1929, a book that analyzed how people responded to poems that they did not know the author of. This helped to form the basis of new criticism and was expanded on by other authors such as the William Epsom and T.S. Eliot. New critics, poetry was a special kind of discourse, a means of communicating feelings and thought that could not be expressed in any other kind of language. Poetic discourse is a type of literary conversation which focuses on the expression of feelings, ideas, imaginations, events, and places through specific rhymes and rhythms. Poetic discourse makes use of common words in appealing ways to present feelings and emotions. It differed qualitatively from the language of science or philosophy, but it conveyed equally valid feelings.
Poetic form and content could not be separated. The experience of reading the particular words of a poem, including its unresolved tensions, is the poem's meaning. The key difference between form and content in literature is that the content is what a text says, while the form is the way of argument of the content. Form and content are the very important aspects of a text. It is not possible to disconnect the two and look at them as completely different components due to their inherent relation. Social literary critics. In this period of social change, it was natural for critics to consider literature in relationship to society and politics. So, literary critics, they are the ones who will judge in comments on the qualities and character of literary works. And critics should understand and consider the relationship of literature in society and politics, especially the relationship between literature and society, because literature indeed reflects the society, its good values and its ills. Literature as an imitation of human action often presents a picture of what people think, say, and do in society. Sociological criticism is influenced by new criticism. However, it adds a sociological element as found with critical theory and considers art as a manifestation of society, one that contains metaphors and references directly applicable to the existing society at the time of its creation. Marxism contributed to the historical approach of outstanding critics such as Edmund Wilson and Kenneth Burke, and to the entire school of New York intellectuals that formed around partisan review and included critics such as Lionel Trilling and Philip Roth. So these people are the literary critics in 19th and 20th century, and they are known for their works and has received a lot of awards because of their works.
Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Dominic Asbacalso, and today I will discuss under American literature the literary theories. Without further ado, let's proceed. So first, let's define what is literary theories or theory. So it is the body of ideas and methods we use in the particular reading of literature. By literary theory, we refer not to the meaning of a work of literature, but to the theories that reveal what literature can mean. Literary theory is description of underlying principles, one might say tools, by which we attempt to understand literature. Additionally, it is literary theory that formulates the relationship between author and work. Literary theory develops the significance of race, class, and gender for literary study, both from the standpoint of biography of the author and the analysis of their thematic presence within text. Lastly, literary theory offers varying approaches for understanding the role of historical context in interpretation, as well as the relevance of linguistic and unconscious elements of a text. Now let's proceed to formalism. So the focus of this theory is the structural components of a text. It indicates that external factors that are not contained within the text are not taken into consideration. Formalism takes place its sole emphasis on the text itself, as well as the components that make up the text, such as its grammar, syntax, signs, literary tropes, and so on. Formalism also draws attention to the structural tendencies that exist within a text or that exist across texts, such as the genre and categories. The study of a text in its own right, rather than a discussion of topics that are more peripheral to the text, is the heart of formalism. So, according to formalism, a text exists independently of any outside influences. When it comes to reading and understanding literary works, formalism is a scientific and technical approach that requires a higher level of mental intelligence than emotional intelligence.
Lastly, formalism does not take into account anything pertaining to culture, politics, and intentions of the author, or the influences of society. And then we have structuralism. Critical theory grew in prominence during the mid-20th century as a result of literary criticism. The Canadian theorist Northrop Wire, whose ideas are closely related to structuralism, had a significant impact in the United States. Northrop Wire's new critical theories were used by Levi Strauss and others to create the theory of structuralism. The study of linguistic constructions is known as structural linguistics. To discover a structure that can lead us to meaning or truth, one studies and analyzes. Literary constructionalism is the study of literature's meaning by analyzing its structure. Critique based on structuralist principles undermines the historical, political, and socio-political context of the text. This is purely reading of the text for the purpose of appreciating the work as timeless. Structuralists believe that the text itself is sufficient and do not require knowledge of the author or the text's socio-political setting. And lastly, we have New Historicism. A literary theory known as a New Historicism aims to better understand literature in the light of contemporary culture, politics, and society as a whole. Those who adhere to New Historicism believe that art is inextricably linked to the social and cultural practices of the time. Stefan Greenblatt developed it in the 1980s. An analysis of a text in relation to political and historical context is what the New Historicism is about. As a result, it can be said that New Historicism is antithesis to New Criticism. New Historicism, on the other hand, rejects the concept of text as an isolated, pure concept. According to New Historicism, a text can't be separated from external influences like economic, society, and material conditions. According to New Historicism, the line between fiction and history is porous. Lastly, both fiction and history must be viewed through the prism of each other. Furthermore, New Historicism teaches that fiction and non-fiction do not exist in a vacuum. And we have here the references of the following text.
Good day, everyone. This is Novel Mayariasga Castro, and I am from Group 4. So our assigned topic is all about the American literature. So in American literature, I'm under with the literary text. Before we proceed to our story, let us define first the literary text. So literary text is a piece of writing such as a book or poem that has the purpose of telling a story or entertaining, as in a fictional novel. So it is a primary function as a text as usually static, but it may be also contain a political message or a belief. Okay, so story time. So in a dark brown dog summary, a street dog befriends a young boy, and the boy likes the dog but often beats him home. The dog follows him home, cowering and begging pardon. This happened on the way home. There is further fighting. When the family returns home, they debate whether or not to keep the dog. So since everyone wants the dog to leave, the father lets it stay. The youngster must now protect the dog from the other family members who feel obligated to kick and beat it. Depending on his mood, the boy seeks out the dog for comfort or abuse. Despite this, the dog finds solace in the boy's stability, feeding, and love. Dad became drunk and rowdy one day. The boy notices and dives for shelter, but the dog doesn't. He kicks and abuses the dog with a coffee pot. and to protect the dog, the child rushes forward. He lifts the dog and throws it. The boy rushes to the dead dog and sits up for hours. And that's the end of the summary of the story. So let us now proceed to the plot. So first, the exposition of the story was supposed to be taken as a metaphor. The dark brown dog was supposed to represent a newly freed slave that has beginning their new life. The family was supposed to reflect the typical attitude of white families during this time period and just they treated former slaves. And the next of the exposition is the rising action. So the rising action is family argues about keeping the dog. So they decided to keep the dog, but they mistreat the dog when the little boy is not with the dog. He is unable to protect him from being physically abused. And now let us proceed to climax. So it took place when the father came home drunk and abused the dog with a coffee pot, and picked him up by one leg and swam him around. And now we are here in the falling action of the story. So, the father was drunk when the child and the dog came home and the child hid, but the dog mistook as it is a game. And finally, we are here in the resolution of the story and the ending of the story. So, the father throws the dog out the window and the child goes to the dog. Let us proceed to the genre of the story. So, the genre is a symbolism fiction. So, why can you say that the story A Dark Brown Dog is a symbolism fiction? Because, symbolism takes something that is usually concrete and associates or affixes it to something else in order to give it a new and more significant meaning. So, in other words, symbolism allows a writer to convey something to their audiences in a poetic way instead of saying it outright. The story A Dark Brown Dog is a symbolism fiction because in the story it clearly stated that the father will mistreat the dog or torture the dog if ever the boy is not around. So it symbolizes the writer's message is to tell the people or the readers that animals have also feelings and life and they are deserved to treat them well and to nurture them as well. And now let us proceed to the figures of speech, and the figure of speech is a metaphor. So he used metaphors such as the dog offered more prayers. So he showed the dog as a person who can offer prayers.
Good day everyone. My topic is all about the story that I have choose in line with our main topic, which is the American literature. And by the way, I'm Iris Cruz, your presenter for today.
So to start our discussion, let us first know what is story. Story is a table that is made up for entertainment or a retelling of something that occurred or a piece of gossip that is being spread. So story is the telling of an event, either true or fictional, in such a way that the listener experiences or learns something just by the fact that he heard the story. Story can also be used to convey knowledge, information, experience, attitude, or point of view. Now we already know what the story means. So now let's proceed to our story, which is Christmas Every Day by William Dean Howells. There was a little girl who wished it was Christmas every day. The little girl wrote and sealed a letter to the Christmas fairy saying she wished every day was Christmas. The next day was Christmas. Everyone opened presents and ate turkey and candy. The next morning, her siblings came to wake her. They told her it was Christmas. When she entered the living room, she could not believe her eyes. It was still a Christmas again. Everyone opened their presents, ate turkeys and candies. The week after that and the month after that, it was still Christmas. Everyone was getting furious. They were tired of Christmas. There were no other holidays. Presents were getting tossed in the trash, in the streets, and anywhere. The presents had no meaning to people or use at all. The price of turkeys, books, clothes, and candy went up to thousands of dollars for they getting scarce. So what do you mean by scarce? Scarce is a situation where there is too little of something or something exists only in very small numbers. People were poor wearing rags. All their money was spent on buying presents. The little girl wished and pleaded to the fairy to never ever have Christmas again. The fairy denied the wish. How about once a week or month or once a year? The fairy said. And later that night, everything went back to normal and Christmas was once a year again. And the people were pleased and happy. So that's the end of the story. Now let's move on to the plot of the story. We have here the introduction where the little girl asked her father to tell her a story. Next was the rising action, where the little girl in the story is greedy and asks the Christmas fairy for Christmas every day. Next was the climax, where the Christmas fairy grant her wish. Next was the falling action, where everyone hates having Christmas every day. Toys are being piled up in garbage. People are becoming homeless, things begin to get expensive, and everyone hates the little girl. Next was the resolution, where the little girl goes back to the fairy and asks if they have Christmas one day a year. And the last one is conflict, where the story is man versus man. It is because everyone is getting mad at the little girl for wanting Christmas every day. So now, the story, which is the Christmas every day, is all about the girl who loves Christmas. And that made her write letters to an old Christmas fairy every year, wishing for it to be Christmas every day. And within William Dean Howells' fiction, fable entitled Christmas Every Day, we can also get some moral lesson that sometimes when you want to be selfish and wish for something that would benefit you and your happiness, you should set your mindset whether it can also surely benefit the people that surrounds you or destroy the whole town on it.
Good day everyone, this is Shanine Marie de Bulusan and my topic is all about the story that I have assigned in a line with our main topic, which is the American literature. So, the story that I will discuss is the story of Timothy Shea Arthur, the story entitled An Angel in Disguise. So, the story started when an unnamed poor woman dies from excess alcohol consumption. She had been outcast in her village due to her addiction, but her death brought the villagers sympathy, so they arranged a proper funeral for her. She dies in front of her 3 children, who included 2 daughters and a son. The village people take pity on these children. So, on seeing their mothers dying before their eyes, the 3 children named John, Kate, and Maggie were utterly frightened. Despite the hatred, anger, and denunciation, the villagers took pity on her. As soon as the villagers heard the news of her death, they went hastily to the old tumble-down hut, and some of them brought with them grave clothes for a decent burial of her body, whereas some of them brought food for the half-starving children. John and Kate were taken away by their new families. John, who's the oldest, was taken in by a farmer, and Kate is taken away by Mrs. Elise. The youngest Maggie, who is disabled and bedridden, is left alone because nobody is ready to take her in that condition. Because Maggie was hopelessly deceased. 2 years before, a fall from a window had injured her spine, and she had not been able to leave her bed since, except when lifted in the arms of her mother. Mr. Thompson, the wheelwright, decides to take her home so that he can take her to the poorhouse the next day, when he knows that his wife would not like her to stay at home forever or accept her. Mrs. Thompson becomes angry and her face is in a flame. When Mr. Thompson carries Maggie in his arms and reaches home, his wife bursts out for bringing that sick brat into her house. And Mr. Thompson begs her to tolerate Maggie for a single day. He asks her to look at her kindly and speak to her gently. When Joe, or Mr. Thompson, looked through the window, he found that Maggie lay, a little raised on the pillow with the lamp shining full upon her face. And Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed and was talking to the child, but her back was towards the window so that her countenance was not seen. He saw that Maggie's eyes were intently fixed upon his wife. He saw nothing of bitterness and pain. This sight lifted a weight from his heart. Mrs. Thompson is all alone with Maggie the whole day. Her attitude towards Maggie changes, and slowly she becomes fond of her. Mr. Thompson notices this change and realizes that it has been dark, cold, and miserable in his house for a long time because his wife had nothing to love and care for, which was the reason for becoming her irritable, ill-tempered, and self-afflicting. Mrs. Thompson said that they would keep her a day or two longer as she was weak and helpless. So Mr. Thompson said that he would not mind if she allowed the poor girl to stay for a day or two. He did not go to see the guardians of the poorhouse on that day, on the next day, nor on the day following. He thought that in less than a week, Mrs. Thompson would leave her the thought of making Maggie leave. The little innocent girl Maggie brought to the home of Joe Thompson a great light and blessing. And now, the sweetness of the sick child was as honey to do her soul, and now Mrs. Thompson carried Maggie in her heart as well as in her arm. The little girl was now a precious burden for her, but this burden gave her great pleasure, and Mr. Thompson considered himself more fortunate to have the girl in his home. Indeed, he had an angel in his house, disguised as a sick, helpless, and miserable child who had filled all the dreary chambers of his house with the sunshine of love. Maggie brought great happiness in the life of the couple. So that's the end of the story. So this is the plot of the story. The external conflict of this short story is Mr. Joe Thompson is against his wife and the rest of the neighborhood. He wants to keep Maggie, the youngest child, but everyone else wants her in the poorhouse. The internal conflict is Mr. Thompson having a hard time making a choice between bringing Maggie to the poorhouse or being her legal guardian. And the rising action is when the villagers were concerned for the care of the children who just lost their mother. John and Kate were taken away by their new families, and people were still making decisions on who would take care of Maggie. The climax is when the villagers started to argue. They all got up to leave, but Mr. Thompson stayed to take Maggie with him. And then the following action is when Mr. Thompson took Maggie, but he was still thinking of putting her under the care of the poorhouse. And lastly, the resolution is the last part when Mr. Thompson's wife finally gave into not having Maggie around and finally started to take care of her.